Good afternoon. Sorry for the delay in start here, but welcome to the 7th presentation in our Command and General Staff School, Author D. Simons Center, sponsored extracurricular InterAgency Brown-Bag Lecture Series. It's the Simons Center's pleasure to partner with the Command and General Staff School to bring you this series that helps develop interagency leaders and improves interagency cooperation. Today's presentation will be recorded so that the thousands of distance learning students, as well as those students that are at the satellite campuses, can benefit from what we're about to hear. So because of that, I'd ask if you have a question or some kind of dialogue during the presentation that you text back here will do it, but go to one of the microphones in the back or at the one of the ones at the table if you use those, so that way the recording will pick up your conversation, please. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to recognize a few dignitaries that are in attendance with us. We have with us Ambassador retired David Lambertson, former U.S. Ambassador to Thailand. We have Ambassador retired Laura Kennedy, former U.S. Ambassador to Turkmenistan. We have Career Minister retired Dirk Dijkerman, former Executive Coordinator of the U.S. Ebola Task Force. And we have Major General retired Michael Szymanski. Thank you all for joining us today. Today we're going to learn about the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. USAID is the lead government agency that works to end extreme global poverty and enable resilient democratic societies to realize their potential. For the military members of the audience, if you haven't yet worked with USAID overseas, you certainly will. It's our pleasure to have today Patrick Wesner. Patrick's a commissioned Foreign Service Officer with the United States Agency for International Development. He currently serves as the Distinguished Chair for Development Studies here at the Command and General Staff College. He has served in Washington, D.C., Mozambique, Malawi, Afghanistan, Bolivia, and Kosovo. Before joining USAID, he served with the Peace Corps in Ethiopia and Guatemala. Patrick's a graduate of the Advanced Strategic Leadership Studies program at the School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth. He holds 2 master's degrees, a Master's of Military Arts and Sciences from his work while at SAMS, and a master's degree in international education from the School for International Training. He did his undergraduate work at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, where he dual majored in sociology and history. Please join me in welcoming the Distinguished Chair for Development Studies, Mr. Patrick Wesner.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming today. As Rod said, my name is Patrick Wesner, and I'm a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. People recognize that? Do we have some people in here that recognize that? There's a couple. Good. Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks again, Rod, for the introduction, and welcome to everyone who's come here today. So this is where we're going today with the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the creation and the evolution of USAID. I'm going to talk about USAID's capabilities, our partnership with DoD. I'm going to talk a little bit about why USAID and foreign assistance matters to DoD personnel, and then conclude with a very brief discussion about my elective course. So I'm going to start this presentation with a picture. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and this picture definitely meets that criteria because of some of the individuals in that picture. Does anyone recognize anyone in the picture? Marshall, obviously. Omar Bradley. There's a couple other people of interest in this picture. All the way to the bottom left is Robert Oppenheimer, famous American nuclear physicist who worked at Los Alamos Laboratories during World War II and who also worked on the Manhattan Project, or America's program to build an atomic bomb. Next to Secretary of State Marshall, not General Marshall in this picture, but Secretary of State Marshall, is James Conant, Dr. James Conant. He is the president of Harvard in this picture. He also would later become the U.S. High Commissioner to West Germany and America's very first ambassador to West Germany. Next to him, obviously, is Omar Bradley, a very famous general in the Army, became General of the Army as a 5-star general, one of less than a dozen 5-star generals in American history. Also a hero of North African and European campaigns in World War II. After the war becomes the head of the Veterans Administration, Chief of Staff of the Army, and then the very first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff after the reorganization of 1947. Next to him is T.S. Eliot, Thomas Stearns Eliot, literary giant in the first half of the 20th century, a distinguished man of letters. He's an American who then changes his citizenship to become a British citizen. Some of his more famous poems you may have heard of include The Wasteland, written in 1919, and also the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which has a very memorable refrain that goes, "In the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo." Do I have any takers? I got one. Okay, perhaps it was my delivery. I don't know. Finally, we're here to talk about George Marshall. We're starting this presentation with Secretary of State George Marshall. And I know amongst this audience I don't have to speak about his history, but I will because I admire him greatly. So he was born in Pennsylvania, close to where I grew up in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. He graduated from VMI, and then he came out here for a year. And he was a student, and then he was an instructor for several more years. He worked for General Pershing during World War I as aide-de-camp, had several interesting positions in the intra-war years, and then he becomes the Chief of Staff of the Army in 1939, a position which he holds for the entirety of World War II. It's really during this time that he becomes an international statesman of the highest caliber and stature, negotiating directly with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill on behalf of FDR. And after the war, he's also a five-star general. So I said there's less than a dozen in American history, and we have two in one picture. It's pretty amazing. So after the war, he is asked by President Truman to go to China to negotiate some sort of reconciliation or peace between the communists and the nationalists. He returns about a year later, not successful in that task. We all know that Mao Zedong chased out Chiang Kai-shek in 1949, chased him into Taiwan. But it doesn't hurt Secretary of State or General Marshall's career, because when he returns, President Truman asked him to become his Secretary of State, and he accepts. And he does two things which I think are pretty amazing when he becomes Secretary of State. One, he reduces the hierarchy so that instead of having 70 or 80 people reporting directly to him, he's got only a handful. And he pushes down decision-making and kind of unlocks some of the blockages to decision-making. And this actually improves morale greatly in the State Department, which had been sidelined during World War II. The other thing that he does is which I think is really amazing for a political appointee, is he listens to his subordinates. Men such as Charles Bolin and Dean Acheson and George Kennan, who had become foreign policy luminaries in their own right during their careers, are telling him that the situation in Europe is untenable, it's unsustainable, there's a very real risk of conflict. And so that brings us to this picture today. This is June 1947, and Secretary of State George Marshall is about to give a commencement address to the graduating seniors of that year. And if you look at the address, if you look at the speech, he never actually says, "Congratulations to the students, congratulations on your hard work," or "I wish you the best of luck in the future." He talks about, for the first 2 or 3 sentences, "I'm very pleased to be here in this very august setting," but then he immediately goes into talking about the situation in Europe. How there's a very real risk that there's going to be civil war or international war. There is poverty and misery gripping the continent, and communism is on the march across Eastern Europe. And so what he says to the Europeans is, America is here to work with you. We're here to partner with you economically, politically, and socially. And this speech becomes known as the Marshall Plan. And in that speech, he demands that the European countries work together to put together a plan to reunite Europe. So the other thing about this speech is it's very hard-hitting, but it's very elegant. And in a lot of ways, it's timeless. And what I mean by that is I read it a couple weeks ago, and I'm reading through it, and I'm asking myself, what time period does this apply to? Because it can apply to so many different time periods. So I'm going to show you a passage, and I want you to look at the passage, and I want you to ask yourself, Does this remind you of any other time periods, either past or present? Go ahead and just take a minute to read it. So I asked you what this reminded you of. I tell you what it reminds me of. That great American iconoclast Mark Twain, who once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Okay, so after the success of the Marshall Plan, the Marshall Plan is in operation for several years. As this slide will attest, both Truman and Eisenhower administrations see the utility in foreign assistance and foreign aid and economic development as a part of our national security toolkit. But what happens is several agencies are created and then they're ended or dismantled several years later. Did you realize that it was even possible for our government to create something and then end it or dismantle it so quickly? And here we did this in a matter of a dozen years. We did this 4 or 5 times. But what it also demonstrates is both administrations think that it's important and it's useful and they see utility in it. So in the 1950s, development assistance, foreign aid is kind of finding its feet. By 1960, 1961, it establishes itself within the national security establishment. So here we have President John Kennedy. He creates USAID in 1961. Fairly soon after he goes into office. He signs the Foreign Assistance Act, which is the legislation governing foreign assistance, and he creates USAID. This is 1962. He is swearing in the very first USAID mission directors and deputy mission directors to go out and take their posts out in the field. So this picture I also find interesting because in this picture, John Kennedy, President John Kennedy, is about my age. He's a couple years older than me in this picture, but he's about my age. He's POTUS. He's the president. He's getting his head handed to him in the Bay of Pigs. He's staring down the Russians during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So say what you will about President Kennedy. He may have been inexperienced. He may have been naive and had very large international ambitions, but he also represented American ambition and that penchant of Americans to try to reform other countries or around the world in our own image. So after the success of the Marshall Plan, after the creation of USAID, USAID kind of, like most organizations, has ebbs and flows, and our priorities change. And those priorities usually mirror our foreign policy priorities of the era. So in the 1960s, because of the success of the Marshall Plan and successful programs in South Korea and Taiwan, and we know they have grown dramatically. There's an idea within the development community that large infrastructure is the panacea to economic transformation. But building or rebuilding in Europe and in certain parts of Asia is not the same thing as doing large infrastructure in the developing world. And infrastructure programs in the 1960s do not lead to the same type of economic transformation that they did in Western Europe. Also, USAID becomes heavily involved in Vietnam. We have 2,300 foreign service officers there at the height of USAID's participation in that conflict. That is more foreign service officers than we have for the entire agency today. And our performance there is widely criticized and widely panned for a lot of different reasons. So in the 1970s, much like the rest of the national defense establishment, USAID does a lot of navel gazing. What is our mandate? What is our priority? What are our priorities? And as a result of that, we refocus yet again, and we say the poorest of the poor is the focus area and basic social services, education, healthcare, family planning. Well, 1980s, President Reagan's elected, and despite us all know that he was a budget cutter, foreign assistance programs and foreign assistance budgets consistently increase over his 2 terms. But he reshapes what we're focused on. Development becomes more focused on security-related aims, also on capitalism, open markets, trade. We're in the last 10 years of the Cold War. Well, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the fall of the USSR, USAID refocuses its mission again to support democratization, rule of law, good governance, especially in Eastern Europe, but really around the world. Then after 9/11, just like the rest of the U.S. government, USAID becomes heavily involved in Iraq and Afghanistan and the nation-building exercises in those two countries. So, no speech about USAID I would be remiss not to include a slide on the 3 Ds of national defense. In the last 4 national security strategies, development is elevated alongside defense and diplomacy as the 3rd pillar of national defense. Obviously, DoD's got the lead on defense and the intelligence agencies. The State Department has the lead on diplomacy, and USAID is the lead government agency on development. So, I just want to now talk about what is USAID, because I've been here for about 20 months. I was over in SAMS last year, and I'm here as a liaison officer to CGSC now. And during that time, I've heard that USAID is a large NGO operating in the North Africa and the Middle East. Or it's a faith-based organization and a charity. Or the most common misconception is that USAID is a large office within the State Department. And I understand this last misconception. USAID and State Department work very closely together. We do joint strategic planning. We do joint budget planning. Our personnel fall under Chief of Mission Authority. But in fact, USAID is an independent government agency. The closest parallel, but our administrator does not report to the President because we're not a cabinet level agency. Our administrator reports directly to Secretary of State. So I understand the confusion. The most common parallel within the military that I find is that between the Marines and the Navy, a relationship that I still don't really understand. It's usually about this time in the presentation that a active duty or a former Marine kind of look at me like, after class or after the presentation, we're going to have a few words outside for comparing the Marines to USAID. Okay, so how many people do we have? We have about 3,500 federal employees. Approximately half of those are in D.C., the other half are overseas in missions around the world. In comparison, State Department has about 25 or 26,000 civilian employees, and DoD has 750,000 civilian employees. So in terms of size and scale, we are definitely limited in what we can do. We are an expeditionary agency. We're out there, but we're out there in limited numbers. We also have about 4,000 host country nationals working with us. Those are citizens in the countries in which we're working, and they are secretaries and drivers and assistants, and they are also doctors and lawyers and specialists and experts in their own fields. So overseas in the missions in which we work, USAID staff fall under Chief of Mission Authority. And our mission director, that's the head of USAID office overseas, is part of the country team. One more thing about, I didn't talk about the budget. I was hoping to avoid that, but I got to say something about the budget. So over the last several years, our budget's been about $21 or $22 billion. In comparison, well, I don't know exactly what the State Department's budget is, but comparison with DoD is about $580, $600 billion. So size matters again. The reason I don't have a budget up here is because we've all seen in the last several weeks that the first Trump administration budget that's come out says that they would like to cut foreign aid by about 30%. So I don't know what the budget will be. I mean, that would impact USAID's operations fairly substantially. This is where we're working around the world. Most of these places we actually have offices in those countries. Some places we just have activities. So we don't have people there, we don't have offices, but we just have activities going on there. So I want to pick apart this mission statement a little bit. So it says we partner. Who do we partner with? We partner with other U.S. government agencies. Obviously, Department of State, Department of Defense, CDC, and others, NSC and others. We partner with host governments. We're in their countries operating. We are supporting their development objectives, as long as they also fit within our own national security and foreign policy interests. We partner with private sector, both in the U.S. and in the countries in which we work, because the private sector going forward is really going to be where the investment comes to sustain long-term development. We partner with NGOs, we partner with international institutions, the World Bank, the UN, we partner with the media, civil society organizations. We partner to do our work, and that's a big part of our culture. We do that to end extreme poverty and promote resilient countries. So resiliency is very important to this mission statement. Why? Because the whole goal is to support countries in a way that if they sustain some economic shock or some sort of election impasse or a natural disaster, that they don't disintegrate into civil conflict, destabilizing not only that country, but the entire region in which that country is found. So resiliency is very key here. Democratic societies, rule of law, democracy, elections, capitalism, while advancing our security and prosperity. This last part's also pretty important. A lot of Americans think that we give foreign aid because we are generous and we are charitable. American people are very generous. But the U.S. government gives foreign aid because it's in our own interest to do so. I like to say that USAID is a or a warm-hearted program, but it's built on hard-headed principles of national self-interest and defense interests and foreign policy interests. So what do we do? What are our capabilities? So I hear many of you in here today, or I hear people out here say that what Big Army does. Well, what Big USAID does is traditional development. And that's doing long-term development, that's economic growth, that's health, that's education, that's good governance, that's long-term development. Not 6 months or a year time period, but 10, 20, 30-year time period. So that's the preponderance of what we do overseas, and we're doing that in poor but relatively stable countries overseas that are not in conflict. Our Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, has anyone ever heard of OFDA? Work with OFDA? Yeah, our Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance responds to international disasters overseas. Natural disasters and man-made disasters. In fact, USAID is the lead government agency on responding to international disasters. Much smaller efforts go to transition, and this is more short-term, immediate impact type of programs that will enable some sort of political transition or national reconciliation, but much smaller. This is in the high-threat environments in Syria, in Libya, in Lebanon, northern Nigeria, etc. And then finally, stabilization captures all three, and this is what we're doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, more so in Afghanistan now than Iraq. But that's where we're doing long-term development, at the same time doing humanitarian assistance for the refugees, and also transition-type programs, which are immediate programs to try to get people to put their guns down. So partnership with DoD, how do we partner together? Actually, what I find interesting is DoD and USAID are similar in a lot of ways in which we're both planning and evaluation and assessment organizations. We plan. So because USAID is the lead government agency on responding to natural disasters overseas, we work with DoD. The fact of the matter is DoD's got funding, it's got authorities, equipment, and capabilities, and a can-do attitude to get after issues that we need. So it really is a comprehensive whole-of-government approach to respond to natural disasters overseas. So in this picture, at the top top right, we have a soldier working with, helping deliver humanitarian assistance. Now I know there are some assumptions about people who work at USAID within this room, and I can confirm that that gentleman in the top right is not a USAID Foreign Service officer. That is a host country national, okay? So down below here, the other way that USAID works with DoD is in these conflict spots, USAID is usually one of the very first organizations back into that country after the military completes military operations. And we need to be able to talk the same language and work with each other. So here we have a USAID worker talking with a soldier, and perhaps they're looking at a map. The challenge is they are looking at that map, but because of their education, their qualifications, and their experience, and perhaps their general outlook on the world, they see different things. They see different boundaries in that map. They see different threats and different opportunities, and while they may use the same language to talk about what's in that map, they mean different things. And so this is really a key challenge for USAID and State Department and DoD to continue to work together because the threats aren't going to stop. This rudimentary map just shows the combatant commands around the world, and USAID's got representatives in all the combatant commands around the world. We have development advisors, we have humanitarian assistance advisors in those combatant commands. That's relatively new. That's within the last 10 years we've began to send our folks to those combatant commands. Also, USAID hosts about a dozen DoD personnel in our headquarters in Washington, D.C., and they come from all different services. They also have one-year fellows, which I think Tim O'Hagan, which is not here today, manages that program. So, why does it matter to DoD? Why does USAID matter to DoD? Okay, to start with, and this may apply more to the SOF community, but USAID is, because we are forward deployed and we're in about 70, 80 countries around the world, and USAID's got contracting abilities, we have funding, we have authorities that DoD doesn't have. Sometimes DoD can leverage USAID overseas to get after issues, non-kinetic issues, that DoD finds important. Also, we all know that foreign assistance, if applied correctly and in the right situation and the right circumstance, foreign assistance is a much cheaper option than sending in a large-scale military operation overseas. And applied correctly, foreign assistance can be that asset that can avert large-scale military requirements. Also, USAID, because of its nature, we influence other countries through our foreign assistance. Other countries like our foreign assistance. They appreciate that. That allows us to use our persuasion diplomacy with those different countries. Also, through our programs, we are able to promote U.S. ideals of and values of democracy and rule of law and open trade and capitalism and free markets. This is just some of the expertise that we have within the agency. As I said earlier, because of the relatively limited number of staff that we have a breadth of experience across our agency. We just don't have a depth. So in our offices overseas, we may have 1 or 2 or 3 agriculturalists. But and those agriculturalists may be managing an $80 or $100 million budget. So we have a lot of different and varied expertise, but just not a depth of expertise. NGOs. Despite, or we may have only 3,500 federal employees and only 1,800 of those are overseas, but we also work almost exclusively through NGOs. And we have hundreds, if not thousands of NGOs around the world that we partner with. And that extends the U.S. government's reach even further, especially outside of the capital cities in the countries in which we reach. Now, a little caution here. I often hear military personnel say, oh, we would like to leverage USAID's NGOs. We'll take advantage or optimize those NGOs. Just a word of caution, many of those NGOs aren't going to want anything to do with the military because they are concerned that it taints their ability to get their job done. And so we're going to have limits to what we can do and what we can ask our NGOs to do. Finally, just one last thing to say. Because of how USAID personnel are posted overseas, we're often over in a country for 4 or 5 years. We stay a little bit longer than other government agencies. And so during that time, we establish very deep relationships with the host government, with all kinds of different constituencies in those countries, including the opposition parties, including the media, and the people of the countries in which we're working. And so there's institutional knowledge and also understanding and relationships built inside that country that can be utilized. Finally, I teach a class here on development in fragile states in USAID. I'm going to teach it twice in the second term, and I would offer it to the students in the room, but I'm not sure if there's that many students actually in the room. But if there are, keep it in mind. If you're interested in what you heard today, please consider enrolling in the class. We just happen to have, as Dirk said, we are fortunate to have a senior retired Foreign Service Officer with USAID here with us today. I asked him to come out to Leavenworth to talk to my classes and some of the other classes about his experience running the Ebola campaign. And I've asked him just to say a couple words about that experience and about the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. And then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me reasonably well? Great. Well, the first likely interaction between DoD and USAID might be through an emergency operation. And so I thought I'd give a little quick 30-second tutorial about what you're going to be running into. Basically, overseas, when we have an emergency and we send somebody out, we call it a Disaster Assistance Response Team, a DART. And then backing them up in Washington, we have a response management team. So the DART can focus on figuring out what's going on and what needs to be done. And all the contracting and all the back office stuff is done in Washington. And we communicate constantly. Now, the concept of the DART and the RMT is something that we borrowed from the U.S. Forestry Service. Because when they respond to a disaster, it's an interagency response with national, local governments, various agencies, and they've developed a lot of ways of working purple, in a sense, and then I mean purple in the military sense. And so we've adopted that concept on how we respond to disasters internationally. Everybody on a team has a role as part of that team, but pretty much everybody comes from a different part of AID or another agency. We often have U.S. Forestry Service people on our teams because we can kind of continue that relationship. But we'll have DoD people on our teams. We will have HHS people. We have others from the various agencies that might be appropriate on the team. So for the Ebola crisis, we had CDC people on our teams. So they work as part of the purple team, but they have their linkages back to their own organizations. So that's been very helpful for us. The thing that's different about this approach is that we don't have something like this building or the amount of time or money to invest in training. So the amount of training that we do on these teams is much more limited than pretty much anything you can imagine in DoD. But we do deploy, we do have practice sessions, but it's just a whole different level of complexity. In the Ebola response, it was big, it was complicated, and we deployed an RMT and a DART. We had LNOs on our response management team in Washington. We had some of the Operation United Assistance people working as liaisons on the DART team in Ebola. This crisis was much more complicated than a number of others. We had, for the first time, U.S. Public Health Service people on our purple team, as well as CDC. And we worked out the bumps. But I think the message here is that every time we come up with a new crisis, we do learn something new. And this is one that we learned a couple other new things. But one of the things that we have done is take the lessons learned. And so in terms of the DoD-USAID relationship in emergencies, we talk to one another through a process called MyTAMS, which is basically a matrix through which AID and DoD agree on what DoD will provide. So USAID will decide what the requirements are, what we want to have done, and then DoD will work for us on how they will staff it, implement it, everything else. And then we agree to it, and then that forms the basis of our work. Lastly, when we're talking about these teams, we're talking about something awfully small. In Ebola, we had no more than 35 people, AID people, working on the DART team in the field at any one point in time. And we were running about 4 other DARTs in the world at the same time, and our bench was air. We were breathing fumes. DoD, when I taught at the National War College, we had the concept of you have 1 deployed, you have 1 in training, and you have 1 resting up. In AID, we have 1 deployed, and that's it. So they go from the emergency in Afghanistan to the emergency in West Africa, come home, change clothes, and go back to East Asia or somewhere else. So we have no bench. And it's a stress. And so the extent to which we can get other agencies working with us is a real benefit. The other benefit of having this operation is not only that we get interagency cooperation and we learn how to communicate with one another, because unlike many other nations, we maintain this expeditionary force, if you will, much smaller than the rest of aid. We're on the ground and we leverage our presence and what we learn to make other countries more informed about what's happening and to inform and try to push the UN and others to modify their programs if we think improvements can be made. So this whole concept is leverage on leverage. AID leverages the interagency to put together a better team that can respond to the crisis, and then using that team in the field, we're able to better leverage what the UN and other donors and NGOs do. So even though we only had about 35 to 40 people on our teams there, our purple teams, through the money that AID programmed, we paid for about 17,000 people working on the Ebola response. That included paying for the salaries of about 800 Africa Union people that came, that were medical people, that had been trained on earlier U.S. government projects of CDC and AID, as well as working with a number of other organizations, World Food Program, UNICEF, et cetera, and other NGOs that are on the scene. So we leverage not only ourselves with other donors, but we really work through others. So let me stop there.
Sure. We can open up if there's any questions.
I wish you'd have had an opportunity to give that presentation to Mick Mulvaney and others in the Trump administration before they made their decisions about foreign aid, which I have to think are going to be modified in the congressional authorization process. You mentioned Vietnam and the 2,300 Foreign Service officers that were there, including some State Department, or perhaps there were also State Department people working for AID in Vietnam. It was a huge operation. It was a stability and nation-building exercise that succeeded to a greater extent than we're generally given credit for, I think. It morphed into the CORDS program. But in those days, AID was big enough that it had a little bit of depth, not just breadth. And you had your own experts in all those many fields in multiple numbers. And in the decades since, AID, it seems to me, has become increasingly a contracting organization. So you got one agriculture specialist overseeing an $80 million program through contracting. Do you envisage any reversal of that trend? I'm assuming that AID can survive this administration, which I'm sure it will. Is it possible that some of that bench can be built up again and AID can be a bit more of a hands-on, direct operating organization like it used to be?
Thanks for the question. You're right. Back in the 1960s, 1970s, we had at our height about 18,000 Foreign Service officers, or maybe it was 16,500 Foreign Service officers, but a lot more than we have today, because they were out there, they were administering the shots, they were the engineers helping build these large infrastructure programs. You're right. Since that time, our staffing has cratered to a large extent, and we are a contracting organization. I think back in somewhere around the turn of the century, maybe we had 1,000 Foreign Service officers. Now we're back up to 1,800, in a large respect because of Henrietta Fore, who came in as Deputy Secretary of State, as well as the head of USAID. She was dual-hatted for a time. That position was dual-hatted back in 2007, 2008, 2009 time period. But while I think that we may be able to hold on to the number of staff that we have now at about 1,800, I do not envisage us going back to having more than 10,000, really not having more than 2,000, and being the ones out in the field, because the U.S. government has taken we contract that out to those NGOs, to those international institutions, and increasingly the idea is to work directly through host governments. It's going to be those host governments that are going to pull themselves up and their citizens out of desperation and poverty in the end. And so we have to enable those governments to deliver services, manage funding, and take the lead on their development objectives. That said, a lot of the partners that we work with overseas are not the most up and up. They don't have the best financial management or stewardship, and our Congress is loath, and really the American people and the American taxpayer should be loath to see our funding wasted. And so it's very difficult to work with other governments and through other governments because we don't necessarily always trust their systems. Gus?
Patrick, we have a strong. Oh, sorry. We have a strong military-industrial complex. The Army is allowed to advertise. We slap our sticker on NASCAR and hikers and geotrekkers. Is AID, one, allowed to advertise? And two, who are your lobbying organizations like AARP or Lockheed Martin or even NRA here in the States that advocate on your behalf to Congress?
I just heard today in class that we are not able to advocate. I'm going to ask Dirk to talk about that. We do have advocates both on the Hill and within the military. You all saw a couple weeks ago when the Trump administration came out with its first skinny budget, is what I think it's called. 100 or more retired 3- and 4-star generals sent a letter saying, hey, we believe that foreign assistance is vital to our national security interest, and we're advising Congress not to cut those budgets. Can you respond to the...
Yeah, for a long time, AID has had a legislative prohibition to taking actions within the United States that had any relationship of potentially asking for more money from Congress. So by advertising what USAID is doing in the United States, it becomes very quickly a gray area that we can be accused of trying to lobby for more money from Congress. So it's something that Congress has taken actions against AID employees for doing that, and it's a very fine line that we try to work on. We do have, as Patrick said, organizations that speak on our behalf, the NGO community, a number of private sector organizations. You have the number of think tanks that are very active on development. But one of the things that, talking about constants, one of the organizations I consulted to as an aid employee, because I was legally allowed to do so, is an organization called ACFA, which is an organization of heads of NGOs that want to work with AID and provide advice to AID so we can have that relationship. And if we go back into the 50s and 60s, they're talking about the exact same problems about Americans don't understand foreign aid. We, the NGOs, can't seem to break the lack of understanding. We don't know what to do any different. What can we try? But the conversations back then are the exact same conversations we still have today when we say, you know, Americans think we have 30% of the budgets on foreign aid when it's less than 0.5% that goes to AID. We haven't cracked that nut, and
but Gus,
we're in a disadvantage.
But Gus, you hit on a very difficult point for USAID. Who is our constituency? It's very difficult to talk to the farmer in Kansas and explain to that person why it's important for us to promote girls' education in Ethiopia. While it may be conventional wisdom in Washington that girls' education leads to less children, greater economic growth, more investment in their children, greater peace and reconciliation if that woman makes it onto a Congress or a parliament, that is very difficult to link that back to that farmer's taxpayer dollars and their ideas of our national security. We have a very difficult time to do that. Any last comments?
Sorry, I don't have a comment, but a quick question. Considering piggybacking off of what you're saying with the uncertainty of USAID's budget for the next perhaps 4 to 8 years, after given that, where do you see the outlook for USAID priorities and projects within that time frame?
So this is nothing new to the agency. I showed you kind of the evolving priorities. There's also another slide on that, evolving challenges. We've had periods over the last 60 years in which either Congress or the President or some other faction within our government did not want to continue to fund foreign aid. So we've contracted and we've expanded several times, and we'll adapt. Now, where do I think the development or foreign assistance will go? I think I look to what the Trump administration has said, that development assistance will be more focused on perhaps shorter-term security interess and in those parts of the world which are of the highest foreign policy or priority for us. So that may mean, and I don't know, this is pure speculation, I have no idea, but that may mean that we get out of certain countries that are really poor and really need some sort of aid or assistance, but aren't really strategically, don't really have much strategic interest to the government. That's a possibility. So I would imagine if the budget comes down as proposed, that you'll see USAID shrink our footprint around the world and close missions, and I'm not sure how that process would go, but there will be most likely a shrinkage. Question in the back?
With Mexico being so close to us, and we're talking about shrinking dollars, and we were talking about building the wall and taking USAID dollars from Mexico to pay for the wall, one of these things of the Trump administration. What is going on with that? Since they're our closest partners to us.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I want to touch that one. I don't think that may be outside the remit of today's presentation.
Well, I'm just saying we're talking about dollars. We're talking about a country that is bordering us, and we're talking about security. And I'm just wondering, how is our let me reframe it. How is our relationship with Mexico and our partners down there? And are we closing down USAID locations down there at this time? Are we having conflict? I mean, at our own border with all the rhetoric that's been going on.
What I can Sure.
Maybe this is a dumb question, but who decides where we go and what money is spent there, or how much of the budget of USAID is spent in a certain country? So maybe that would help kind of answer, if we're in Mexico, why we're in Mexico.
Sure. As far as I know, we are not closing our USAID mission in Mexico at this point. That mission, that USAID mission down there has resources from prior years, and there will be some, I would assume, some resources provided in the next year. So at this point, USAID Mexico, that's what our office is called down there, is not closing, as far as I know. Who decides? Well, Congress appropriates the funding. And then it goes into, as far as I know, and maybe I'll ask Dirk here as well, because he was at the State Department in charge of the budget shop. But that then process goes through a lot of discussion between state and USAID and the NSC about what countries will get what type of resources for the following year. Now, from my perspective as a peon in the budget process, how I see it happen is last year's budget was $250 million, or last year's budget was $50 million. This year's budget will be $51 million. And that's my experience being out in the field. I assume there are more strategic discussions to try to decide what the budget should be, but I'm not privy to those. You want to add anything on how the budget is decided by country?
Well, typically it's an incremental process, but every now and then you can have a big reset. And one of the things that could happen with this change in administration is having that reset. When Condoleezza Rice came in and created the new Office of Foreign Assistance, we reset budget priorities. We looked at all the countries where we were providing assistance. We looked at them in terms of how effectively they could use the resources. We looked at them on what their importance was for DoD military perspective and from a political perspective. And we looked at what we were trying to achieve in some of these areas. And from that, we came up with, if you will, a way of equalizing things across countries to see how much money and how much staff they had. And then Secretary Rice accepted that, and we made some dramatic shifts that reduced money going to Latin America, increasing money to Africa, reducing money to Europe, and some other adjustments like that. Those things, and I've been part of about 2 times that AID has done that in about 30 years, and I've been part of both of them. You can only do that 1 year, and then you kind of go back into your normal process. But the other factor that comes into play is Congress, because the type of money we get may not be the type of money we would like. When I was in the Policy Bureau, I was asked to help support the Nigerian government's movement to democracy. And I said, great. And where I am in the fiscal year and where everything else is going on is all I've got is family planning money. So if we're supposed to reward the Nigerian government for making a move towards democracy, this is it. I can give them family planning money, period. And said, that's stupid, but that's all you got. So the reality of the resources comes into play. And
That's an interesting point about the earmarks because, for example, I was in Mozambique, and the budget that came out there is a pretty large budget, heavily favored towards HIV/AIDS through President Bush's PEPFAR program, Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. But the funding that came out at $250 million, almost all of that was earmarked by Congress, saying, okay, USAID mission in Mozambique and USAID embassy or U.S. embassy and personnel out there, you're getting this money, but you have to spend it in these buckets. You have to spend it on these different things. And so there are a lot of earmarks that come out of Congress and that we have to respond to, and we have to spend the money that meet those earmarks.
We have time for one last question.
Doug?
In the execution of your programs in the field, have you in the past, and do you still have to comply with the Buy America Act in getting as much hard equipment and material that you use in those projects, and also contracting personnel that money try to be spread amongst American taxpayers rather than just on the international economy?
Yeah, I was just looking to Dirk. I think that there are a lot of waivers out there, but one thing I want to point out about who is implementing our programs. So, like I said earlier, NGOs implement the majority of our programs and our activities. And those NGOs are based in the United States, and they generally employ Americans. Not all the time. Sometimes they employ people from other countries. But USAID, a large majority of our partners are American organizations employing Americans who are paying taxes in this country. When we're responding to famine overseas or natural disaster overseas, a lot of the food aid comes from Middle America. And it's sent using American shippers, and it gets to those places using American businesses.
Yeah, I think that's and you pointed out that USAID can't lobby and use information operations, but I think that's a significant message that's lost on the American people, that it's not just American money dumped overseas. It's going, a large percentage of it's going right back into a U.S. taxpayer's pocket.
Yeah, I think there's a misconception out there as well that USAID funding is mostly going to these corrupt governments, going directly to the corrupt governments, and that is very far from the truth, that we don't actually fund those governments directly, usually, unless we have confidence in their financial systems.
Well, Patrick, on behalf of the Commander General Staff School and the Simons Center, thank you very much. We appreciate your presentation. They'll be here for a couple of minutes, Minister Dickerman, if anybody has any comments they'd like to make afterward. Thank you all for coming. Around the room is the latest edition of our Interagency Journal that was just published about a week and a half ago. You're welcome to take those. Those that aren't here, they're also down on the lower, at the foundation offices down back behind the cafeteria area. Thank you for coming.